In the frozen stillness of a December morning in 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge tore through the Ardennes with brutal force, a small Belgian town became the stage for one of the most astonishing moments of World War II. Bastogne, encircled, battered and shivering under -20-degree winds, held just 14,000 American soldiers who were exhausted, undersupplied, and outnumbered 5-1 by a German army determined to crush them. It was here, in a makeshift headquarters inside a battered stone building, that German envoys delivered what they believed would be the obvious conclusion to the siege: a demand for the Americans to surrender to save unnecessary bloodshed. The officers expected negotiations, fear, hesitation, perhaps even desperation. Instead, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, glanced at the typed ultimatum, laughed in disbelief, and uttered a single word that would echo far beyond the snow-covered ruins of Bastogne. That word, both defiant and utterly unexpected, would become a symbol of American resolve and turn an impossible situation into a legend. This is the story of how one brief, almost casual reply stunned the German command, electrified American troops on the brink of collapse, and helped shape the outcome of the largest battle the US Army would fight in World War II. Setting the stage, Hitler's final gamble and the road to Bastogne. In the final months of 1944, as Allied armies pushed steadily toward Germany's western border, Adolf Hitler launched a desperate and audacious counter-offensive meant to fracture the Allied advance and force a negotiated peace. He called it Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, but the world would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. With winter storms grounding Allied aircraft and masking German movements, Hitler massed over 200,000 troops, 1,400 tanks, and thousands of artillery pieces across a 70-mile front in the dense Ardennes forest. His goal was nothing less than splitting the British and American armies, capturing the port of Antwerp, and reversing the course of the war. At the centre of this plan sat a crucial crossroads: Bastogne, a small Belgian town whose network of 7 converging roads made it the logistical heartbeat of the region. If the Germans controlled Bastogne, they could funnel armour and infantry westward in a rapid thrust toward the Meuse River. If they failed, the offensive would choke in the narrow forest roads behind them. The Americans, caught off guard by the ferocity and scale of the attack, scrambled to reinforce the collapsing front. Among the units rushed forward with almost no preparation was the 101st Airborne Division, the famed Screaming Eagles, sent to hold Bastogne at all costs. Their arrival marked the beginning of one of the most improbable defensive stands in military history. The Screaming Eagles step into the storm. When the 101st Airborne Division received orders to move toward Bastogne, many of its paratroopers were still recovering from months of brutal fighting in Normandy and Holland, expecting a period of rest and refitting that never came. Instead, trucks screeched to a halt in the early hours of December 18, 1944, and the men were shaken awake with urgent commands to gear up and move out immediately. Most had no winter clothing, no overshoes, and only limited ammunition and medical supplies. They climbed into open trucks and endured a bone-freezing journey through sleet and snow toward the front, their breath turning to ice on their collars as they tried to sleep standing upright. By the time they reached the outskirts of Bastogne, German armoured divisions were already pressing in, overrunning villages, cutting roads, and pushing terrified civilians ahead of them. The paratroopers, tough, confident, and trained for rapid response, took their positions in the forests and fields surrounding the town, digging foxholes in rock-hard, frozen earth. Many used their helmets, bayonets, or even bare hands just to scrape a shallow depression before the ground refused to yield further. Despite the chaos and their unprepared state, the division quickly formed a defensive perimeter. General Anthony McAuliffe, temporarily commanding the 101st after Major General Maxwell Taylor's absence, directed his officers with calm efficiency, pushing units into position to block every approach into Bastogne. The Screaming Eagles knew they were walking into a storm, but none yet realized they would soon be entirely cut off, surrounded and alone against the heart of Hitler's last offensive. A town under siege, Bastogne, surrounded. By December 20th, the storm the paratroopers had marched into had closed around them completely. German armoured spearheads, battle-hardened panzer units supported by infantry and artillery, sealed off every road leading into Bastogne, completing a deadly ring of steel around the town. The 7 critical highways that once made Bastogne a logistical treasure now became the very corridors through which destruction advanced. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets as the temperature plunged to -20 degrees, turning foxholes into icy coffins and freezing wounded men before medics could reach them. Inside the encircled perimeter, 14,000 American troops faced more than 55,000 German soldiers backed by tanks, heavy artillery and Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, whose eerie screams haunted the nights. Supply lines were severed, ammunition was limited, medical bandages were reused, and food rations dwindled rapidly. Artillery shells rained on the town daily, reducing homes, churches and farms to shredded timber and shattered stone. Families huddled in cellars, praying for the thunder outside to end. The Americans held firm, but they understood the truth. They had no air support, no reinforcements, and no way out. In the midst of this tightening vice, McAuliffe's calm leadership kept the lines from breaking. Patrols probed enemy positions, roadblocks were fortified, and each unit knew it held a piece of a shrinking circle that could not afford to give an inch. Bastogne was now an island of resistance in a sea of enemy forces, and every soldier understood that survival depended on endurance, discipline, and the hope that help, if it ever came, would arrive before the Germans overwhelmed them. Inside the foxholes, voices from the men who held the line. For the soldiers in the frozen woods around Bastogne, the siege was not defined by grand strategy or sweeping troop movements, but by the relentless grind of survival. Hour by hour, shell by shell, breath by breath. Paratroopers like Leo Palmer recalled the bitter cold that pierced through every layer of clothing, saying it felt as if the air itself wanted to kill you. Ernest Premetz remembered how the men slept standing up or crouched in shallow foxholes because lying down meant freezing into the ground. Many wrapped torn parachute silk around their boots to keep snow out, and some went days without warm food, relying on whatever scraps remained in their pockets. Mortar bursts showered the trees with deadly wooden splinters, a phenomenon soldiers grimly nicknamed tree bursts. Medics worked around the clock in dim basements lit by flickering candles, fighting to save men with little more than morphine syrettes and scavenged supplies. Vincent Vicari described the constant psychological weight of German artillery. You heard the whistle and you prayed it wasn't yours. Even in these conditions, small moments of humanity flickered through the misery. Soldiers shared cigarettes with trembling civilians, they passed around letters from home, they cracked jokes to mask the fear. What kept them going was not bravado, but an unspoken pact between brothers in arms. Each man determined not to let the line break, not to leave the others exposed, not to surrender the frozen ground beneath their boots. The siege was a test of endurance as much as combat, and every paratrooper who braced against the cold and gunfire carried the weight of Bastogne's fate on his shoulders. The German ultimatum: surrender or be annihilated. On the morning of December 22nd, with the siege tightening and German forces confident that the Americans were nearing collapse, a small delegation of German officers approached the lines under a white flag, escorted by soldiers from the 327th Glider Infantry. They carried a formal written message addressed to the commander of the US forces in Bastogne, a document typed with stiff bureaucratic precision but laced with unmistakable menace. The note demanded the honourable surrender of the encircled American troops to prevent what the Germans warned would be total annihilation. It cited the overwhelming strength of the German artillery and armour surrounding the town, and insisted that if the Americans refused, the German command would have no alternative but to order the annihilation of the US garrison. The ultimatum gave McAuliffe precisely 2 hours to respond. Inside his cramped headquarters at the Bastogne Seminary, officers gathered as the message was read aloud. For a moment, the room fell silent, the weight of the siege and the strain of the past days pressing down on every man. Outside, wounded soldiers lay bundled under blankets in the courtyard, artillery thudded in the distance, and the sky hung low with snow. The Germans believed the Americans had reached their breaking point. They expected negotiations, perhaps a plea for terms. What they did not expect was the response they were about to receive, one that would become an immortal expression of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. McAuliffe's one-word answer that echoed through history. Inside the battered seminary that served as his command post, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe listened to the German ultimatum, blinked in disbelief, and let out a short, exasperated laugh before muttering the word that would soon become legend: nuts. His staff officers looked at one another, half amused, half stunned, before McAuliffe waved off the notion of surrender entirely. When his men reminded him he still needed a formal written reply, McAuliffe hesitated, considering a more traditional military response. But Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard quickly spoke up. "General, that first answer of yours would be hard to beat." McAuliffe grinned and agreed. A clean sheet of paper was rolled into the typewriter, and the message, simple, baffling, and defiantly American, was typed. To the German commander, nuts. The American commander. The reply was handed to the German delegation, who read it with puzzled expressions as they struggled to interpret the slang. One American officer helpfully explained, "It means go to hell." Word of the one-word rejection spread through the frozen foxholes like wildfire. Exhausted paratroopers, half-starved and half-frozen, burst into laughter and pride. "That's our answer," one soldier said, slapping his rifle. It was a spark of morale at a moment when morale was desperately needed. In a siege defined by misery and danger, McAuliffe's single defiant word became a rallying cry, a reminder that surrender was unthinkable, and a message to the Germans that Bastogne would not fall without a fight. After the answer, the battle intensifies. The German commanders, stunned by the absurd defiance of McAuliffe's one-word reply, wasted no time turning their frustration into fury. Almost immediately after the ultimatum expired, the ring around Bastogne tightened as artillery batteries unleashed a savage bombardment that shook the frozen ground and sent splinters of shattered trees raining down on the American positions. Tanks rumbled forward along narrow forest roads, their engines growling through the snow-clogged woods, while German infantry advanced in waves, probing for any weakness in the American perimeter. The defenders understood that McAuliffe's answer had not ended the conversation. It had escalated it. Every approach to the town erupted into firefights. At Marvy, Noville, and the woods north of Hemroul, paratroopers and tank destroyer crews fought off repeated assaults, using every shell, every bullet, and every ounce of strength they had left. The siege grew even more brutal as German commanders tried to break the lines before American reinforcements could arrive. Day and night blurred together in a cycle of barrages, counterattacks, and desperate defensive maneuvers. Men who had been living on half rations for days stuffed snow into their mouths to quench their thirst. Weapons froze, boots froze, even blood froze in shallow basements crowded with wounded. Yet McAuliffe's refusal had lit something inside the garrison, a fierce pride that kept the men anchored to their positions, no matter how strong the hammer blows against them became. Bastogne was now fighting not just for survival, but for the meaning of that one word. Nuts would stand only as long as the lines held. Holding out against impossible odds. As the siege dragged into its darkest days, Bastogne became a crucible in which human endurance was tested beyond imagination. Ammunition dwindled to the point where some units rationed bullets individually, saving each one for the exact moment it might matter most. The 326th Medical Company, already overwhelmed, began treating wounded men in freezing basement aid stations with little more than sulfur powder and torn bedsheets for bandages. Some medics removed shrapnel using penknives heated over candles. Civilians, trapped in the town's shattered buildings, endured the same relentless shelling as the soldiers, sharing cellars with the wounded and helping medics tend to men who screamed through the night. Food grew so scarce that paratroopers sometimes went a full day without a warm meal, surviving on cold sea rations or whatever scraps they could scrounge. The cold itself became an enemy as deadly as the Wehrmacht. Frostbite blackened toes and fingers, rifles jammed with ice, and men huddled together just to keep their blood moving. Yet the perimeter held, largely because each sector's defenders refused to yield an inch. Stories spread of machine gun crews staying at their posts even when shells blew their foxholes apart, of tank destroyer teams dragging their own frozen weapons into new positions under fire, of runners sprinting through the open streets of Bastogne to deliver messages as shells burst around them. Against all logic, morale remained unbroken. McAuliffe's defiance and the shared suffering forged a stubborn determination among the defenders. They knew relief was supposed to be coming from the south, but until it arrived, the men of Bastogne would face the storm alone, holding the crossroads with grit, brotherhood, and sheer refusal to give in. Patton turns his army north. While Bastogne endured its bitter isolation, more than 100 miles to the south, General George S. Patton was preparing one of the most audacious maneuvers of the war. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, had been anticipating a German offensive and had already rehearsed contingency plans that allowed his divisions to pivot with stunning speed. When the crisis in the Ardennes erupted, Patton promised General Eisenhower that he could disengage from his current operations, wheel 3 entire divisions, and drive north to relieve Bastogne in just 48 hours, a claim that left many commanders incredulous. But Patton delivered. His troops began the massive turn almost immediately, grinding through blizzards, icy roads, and traffic-choked routes as they pushed toward the encircled town. Patton himself prayed openly for clear skies, famously asking God to restrain these immoderate rains so Allied aircraft could fly again. On December 23rd, the weather finally broke. Blue skies opened above the snow-covered landscape, and American planes roared overhead, dropping vital supplies to the trapped defenders and punishing German positions with renewed ferocity. With air support restored, Patton's columns pushed harder, fighting their way through fierce German resistance in towns like Martelange and Assenois. His soldiers advanced mile by mile through minefields, ambushes, and artillery fire, knowing Bastogne could fall at any moment. Every hour they gained was bought with blood and grit. It was a race against time, against weather, and against the tightening German noose, and the men of the Third Army intended to win it. At December 26th, the breakthrough that saved Bastogne. By the morning of December 26th, the siege had reached its most critical point, with German forces launching repeated attacks to crush the exhausted garrison before Patton's men could fight their way through. Inside Bastogne, ammunition was nearly gone, medical supplies were depleted, and many units were running on little more than willpower and frozen determination. Yet even as German tanks pressed against the southern edge of the perimeter, the distant rumble of engines signalled a change. At approximately 4:50 p.m., soldiers of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion spotted movement through the trees near the village of Assenois, American tanks from the 37th Tank Battalion of Patton's 4th Armoured Division bursting through the German lines. The first Sherman tank to break the siege was commanded by Lieutenant Charles Bulge, who rolled up the road into Bastogne as paratroopers cheered with hoarse, exhausted voices. Men who had gone days without sleep stumbled out of foxholes to shake hands with the liberators, their breath fogging in the frigid air. The corridor was narrow and still dangerous, but it was open. Bastogne was no longer alone. German attacks continued for days, but the tight ring had been broken, and the defenders' relief was palpable. Patton later joked that the 101st wasn't rescued at all, insisting they had famously said, "We're not surrounded, we're just in a target-rich environment." Whether he said it or not, the sentiment captured the spirit of the defenders who had endured one of the harshest sieges of the war. Bastogne had held, the German offensive had been blunted, and the momentum in the Ardennes began to swing decisively toward the Allies. The breakthrough of December 26th was more than a tactical victory. It was the moment the tide of Hitler's final gamble truly began to collapse. What nuts meant the legacy of a one-word defiance. In the aftermath of the siege, as supply convoys rumbled into Bastogne and wounded men were evacuated from cellars and frozen aid stations, the full significance of McAuliffe's one-word message came into focus. Nuts was more than a quip. It became a symbol of the American spirit under fire, a testament to how ordinary soldiers and officers met overwhelming odds with grit, humour, and unshakable resolve. Historians later noted that McAuliffe's response had an immediate psychological effect. It mocked the German demand, shattered their expectations of American exhaustion, and infused the defenders with a renewed sense of purpose precisely when morale could have crumbled. The word echoed through the Allied lines in the days that followed, travelling faster than official reports, turning into a rallying phrase repeated in foxholes, mess halls, and command posts. Even soldiers outside the Bastogne perimeter began repeating it as a shorthand for refusal to yield. For the Germans, the message became a point of bewildered fascination, a moment when their carefully calculated intimidation met an answer they were culturally and linguistically unprepared for. For the Americans, it embodied the unity of the siege, officers and infantry, medics and artillerymen, all standing together against a stronger enemy, because surrender simply did not fit the character of the men holding that frozen crossroads. Long after the guns fell silent in the Ardennes, nuts remained a powerful reminder that the fate of battles can sometimes hinge not only on weapons or numbers, but on the spirit behind a single, defiant word. Why Bastogne still matters today. As the years have passed, and the veterans of Bastogne have grown older or faded into memory, the story of their stand remains one of the most enduring chapters in the history of World War II, not because of sweeping manoeuvres or grand speeches, but because of the raw human courage shown in the worst of circumstances. The Bastogne siege embodies the idea that resilience can take root even in frozen soil, that leadership can shine through exhaustion and fear, and that a single moment of defiance can resonate far beyond the battlefield. General McAuliffe's one-word response still echoes today, not only as a clever retort, but as a symbol of an unbreakable will, a refusal to be intimidated by overwhelming odds. The men of the 101st Airborne, supported by tank destroyer crews, engineers, medics, and Belgian civilians, turned a desperate defensive stand into a defining demonstration of unity and sacrifice. Modern military leaders study Bastogne for its tactical lessons, but ordinary people look to it for something deeper. The reminder that adversity, no matter how crushing, can be met with determination and resolve. And as we return to that cold December morning and the incredulous chuckle of a general reading an ultimatum under siege, we are reminded that the power of a single word, spoken at the right moment, can shape history. In that sense, the story of Bastogne does more than recount a battle. It calls us back to the opening moment of this tale, when one simple, defiant word stunned an enemy and inspired a generation. Such is the enduring echo of nuts